There is a building in Lahore, a building in Lima, and a building in Lyon that share the same door proportions. Not similar, not approximately aligned, the same, within tolerances that would satisfy a modern engineer. The arched openings, the column spacing, the relationship between wall mass and window void, they follow ratios so consistent that if you overlaid the drawings at scale, the outlines would not drift more than a few inches. These buildings were constructed on different continents, in different centuries by people who had no documented contact with each other, and yet they arrived at the same solution. I found this while looking for something else entirely. I was researching water infrastructure in colonial-era South Asia, specifically the stepped reservoirs called Vav or Baoli, the ones cut deep into the earth in Gujarat, and I kept stumbling into architectural surveys from the 1840s and 1850s, where British engineers were documenting structures they couldn't quite explain. The language in those reports is careful, clinical, but underneath the careful language, there's something that reads a lot like unease. I kept pulling that thread, and the further I pulled, the less comfortable I got. Here is the thing about architectural history that most people never think about. We assume the story of human building is one of gradual divergence, isolated cultures, developing in isolation, arriving at different solutions to the problem of shelter. The pyramid building of Egypt, the timber framing of medieval Europe, the rammed earth construction of the Sahel, we treat these as evidence of how differently people think, how place shapes, culture shapes form. It's a satisfying narrative. It maps onto everything else we believe about human history. But there are windows in that narrative, and when you look through them, the view is strange. In 1847, a civil engineer named Francis Buckley was surveying the outskirts of Peshawar for the East India Company. He was cataloging existing structures, walls, foundations, cisterns, as part of a larger infrastructure assessment. In his field notes, preserved in the British Library under reference IOR P96, Buckley describes encountering a series of cut stone foundations that he initially assumed were the remnants of Mughal-era construction. Standard assumption for the region, reasonable methodology. But when he measured the column bases, he found they matched, his word underlined, matched, the proportions he had documented in his previous posting. His previous posting had been Madras, southern India, thousands of miles away. A different geology, a different material culture, a different ruling lineage. He wrote, "The coincidence disturbs me more than I can professionally justify." Buckley's notes are not widely cited. They don't appear in the standard histories of colonial-era engineering surveys. But they're there. You can request them. They're real. Now, before I go further, I want to be honest about something, because I think intellectual honesty is the only thing that separates genuine inquiry from the kind of content that just wants you to be alarmed. What Buckley observed could have a straightforward explanation. Architectural proportions are partly constrained by physics. Stone behaves a certain way. Arches require specific geometries to stand. It's possible, genuinely possible, that independent cultures, working with the same materials and the same gravitational constant, converged on similar solutions through parallel evolution. This happens in biology all the time. Wings, eyes, fins, independent structures, arriving at similar functions. That's the null hypothesis, and it deserves respect. But parallel evolution in biology produces structures that are similar in function and different in every genetic detail. What I kept finding was something more specific than functional similarity. What I kept finding was the same ratio, the same number. The number is 1 to 1.6 on 18. You may recognize it. The golden ratio. Phi, the proportion that appears in a nautilus shell, in the spacing of sunflower seeds, in the branching of trees. Mathematicians have known about it since antiquity. Euclid described it, the Greeks used it, and we've spent centuries arguing about how consciously it was applied in classical architecture. The Parthenon, the Great Pyramid, these are well-worn debates, and I'm not going to rehearse them here. What I want to point you toward is something different, something that I think has been hiding in plain sight, dismissed as coincidence because the alternative implication is one that nobody in academic architecture wants to formally state. In 2009, a researcher at the University of São Paulo named Dr. Adriana Ferraz published a comparative study of pre-Columbian construction in the Andean highlands. Her dataset was not designed to find what she found. She was doing ordinary archaeological survey work, cataloging sites, measuring structures, recording materials. At some point in her analysis, she noticed that the average door frame height in the structures she was measuring followed a consistent internal ratio, height to width. She calculated it across her dataset, then recalculated it because she assumed she had made an error. The ratio was phi 1 to 1.618, accurate to 3 decimal places across dozens of structures, spanning at least 4 distinct cultural groups and roughly 800 years of construction. Her paper was published. It received modest attention. It did not receive the kind of sustained scholarly engagement that I would have expected given what the numbers show. Faraz's dataset is publicly available through the FAPE-SP research portal. The measurements are there. The math is there. You can run it yourself. Now hold that number against something else. In 1998, an architectural historian named James Whitmore was compiling a survey of pre-modern construction in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically the Great Zimbabwe Complex, the stone enclosures built between the 11th and 15th centuries in what is now Zimbabwe. Whitmore was particularly focused on the conical tower inside the great enclosure, the solid stone structure whose purpose remains genuinely unknown. He measured it in detail, height, diameter, the taper of the outer wall. He published a footnote, not a headline, a footnote, noting that the ratio of the tower's base diameter to its height, when calculated precisely, was 1 to 1.618. One researcher in Brazil, one researcher in southern Africa. The same number. Structures separated by an ocean, by centuries, by every conceivable cultural transmission path. I don't know what to do with this. I want to be honest. I genuinely don't know. The historian's instinct is to reach for diffusion, to ask whether there was contact, whether a shared tradition could have spread through trade routes and migration. And there were trade routes. The Silk Road, the Indian Ocean networks, the overland paths across the Sahara. Cultural transmission happened. We know it happened. But there are limits to what transmission can explain. The Andean highlands were not on the Indian Ocean trade network. Pre-Columbian construction in Peru was not receiving blueprints from the East African coast. If this is diffusion, it requires a source, a common origin point, something that all of these separate traditions received and then carried forward across millennia. And that is where the history gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because there is another way to read the evidence, and it goes like this. What if the architectural consistency we see before the mid-19th century is not the product of isolated parallel evolution or of a single diffused tradition, but of a common body of knowledge, a working technical understanding of proportion, geometry, and structural efficiency that was more broadly shared than our current historical models allow? What if the pre-modern world was, in some specific technical sense, more connected than we have been taught? I want to be careful here. I am not claiming there was a secret global civilization. I am not claiming suppressed knowledge or deliberate erasure. Those are dramatic conclusions, and I don't have dramatic evidence. What I have is a pattern that doesn't fit the standard model, and a series of dates that keep pulling my attention back. The Great Exhibition in London, the first True World's Fair, the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, filled with machinery and manufactured goods from every nation that could send a delegation. It is remembered as a celebration of industrial progress, and it was. But it was also something else. It was the moment when the architectural vocabulary of the industrializing world began to diverge, rapidly, visibly, irreversibly, from the architectural vocabulary of everywhere else. Iron and glass structures, steel frames, mass-produced ornament, buildings that could be assembled in weeks from components manufactured miles away. Within 30 years of 1851, the cities of Europe and North America looked fundamentally different from how they had looked a century before. Within 50 years, that new vocabulary had begun spreading globally, first through colonialism and then through cultural aspiration. The mid-19th century is the break. Before it, a convergence that nobody fully explains. After it, a divergence that everybody celebrates as progress. I want to tell you about a man named Thomas Phillips Maunder, because I think his story captures something that the architectural surveys don't. Thomas Maunder was born in 1801 in Bridgewater, Somerset. His father was a stonemason. His grandfather was a stonemason. He learned the trade from the age of 7, carrying stone, mixing lime mortar. learning by watching how his grandfather's hands moved over a surface, learning not from instruction, but from accumulated practice, from the 10,000 small decisions that experienced hands make without conscious thought. He was apprenticed formally at 14. By 30, he was a journeyman mason of considerable reputation, working on church restorations and civic buildings across the southwest of England. In 1847, the year Buckley was measuring foundations in Peshawar, Maunder was working on the restoration of a medieval guild hall in Bristol. His personal journal, held at the Bristol Record Office, catalogued under reference BRO 28169, describes his work in technical detail that is unusually precise for a craftsman's diary. He records the proportions of original stonework he was matching, the specific mix of lime he was replicating, the way the original builders had achieved a particular quality of surface finish that he had never seen in contemporary work. He writes, "The men who built this knew something we have forgotten how to know." He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't explain what he means. But he writes it twice, on different pages, weeks apart, as if it kept returning to him. Maunder died in 1863. His son became a plumber. His grandson worked in a factory. The line of practice, the accumulated knowledge carried in the hands and the eye and the intuition of stonemasons, ended in one generation. Not because anyone suppressed it, not because anyone decided it was dangerous. It ended because the new materials and the new methods arrived and the economics changed, and there was no longer a market for what Thomas Maunder's hands knew how to do. Imagine the last day he ever laid stone professionally. He would have been in his late 50s. He would have smoothed mortar into a joint with the same motion he had learned watching his grandfather. He would have stepped back to check the line the way masons always step back, tilting the head slightly, reading the surface with the eye the way a musician reads a score, and then he would have gone home. And that specific quality of knowing, that particular accumulation of practice that connected him backward to the medieval builders and, through them, to something older, ended. It didn't make the news. It wasn't recorded as a loss. It was just a man going home at the end of a working day, carrying knowledge that had no market anymore. This is what I keep coming back to. The architectural convergence before 1850 is strange. The mathematical consistency is hard to explain. But what makes me genuinely uneasy, what wakes me up in the middle of the night more than any single ratio or measurement, is the question of what was lost in the transmission gap. When knowledge is carried in practice, in the body, in the relationship between apprentice and master, it doesn't leave documents. It doesn't leave blueprints. It leaves buildings. And the buildings last longer than the people who knew how to read them. There is a specific type of Roman concrete called opus incertum, irregular-faced rubble, set in mortar, that was used in construction from roughly the 2nd century BCE. Engineers have been analyzing it for decades, and they keep finding something they can't fully replicate. The lime mortar used in maritime opus incertum structures actually strengthened over time when exposed to seawater. Modern Portland cement weakens in marine environments. Roman maritime concrete, in some specimens, became harder and more durable over 2,000 years of saltwater exposure. The chemistry has now been partially explained. A specific mineral called tobermorite forms as the seawater reacts with the volcanic ash in the mix. But the Romans didn't know that. They didn't have the analytical chemistry to know that. They knew it worked because they had learned through accumulated practice, through generations of masons mixing lime and pozzolanic ash from the Campi Flegrei, that this particular combination in this particular ratio produced structures that lasted. That knowledge, the recipe, the practice, the feel of the mix in the hands, died with the Roman building tradition. We recovered it from chemistry. We lost it from memory. Now here's the number that I can't stop thinking about. The United States Census Bureau documented, through a series of surveys conducted between 1880 and 1920, the collapse of skilled craft trades in the American economy. Stone masonry, lime burning, structural carpentry using timber frame joinery. Between 1880 and 1920, the number of practicing craftsmen in these trades fell by a calculated 84%. Not 84% relative to population growth, 84% in absolute terms. There were fewer stonemasons in America in 1920 than there had been in 1880, in a country whose population had nearly doubled in the same period. 84% in 40 years. That's not gradual change. That's not slow evolution of technique. That is a cliff edge, and the 1920 number includes workers who use the term mason to describe labor in the New Portland. Cement and reinforced concrete industries, people whose practice bore no relationship to what Thomas Maunder's hands knew. If you filter for traditional lime and stone work, the actual number is lower. Historians of craft technology who have done this filtering estimate the functional extinction of traditional masonry knowledge in the American industrial context at somewhere between 1895 and 1910. Gone. Within living memory of people still alive in 1950. Within the memory of people who are now dead. The question that this history doesn't quite answer, that I don't think anyone has fully asked, is what was in that knowledge besides technique, because the buildings it produced, the ones that are still standing, the ones that Buckley and Maunder and Ferraz and Whitmore kept measuring and documenting and finding strange, those buildings contain ratios and proportions and structural qualities that we understand only partially through analysis and reverse engineering. We can see what the knowledge produced. We can't entirely reconstruct what the knowledge was. There are 14 medieval cathedrals in France that were built to the same height within 5 feet of each other. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Beauvais, the famous ones, the ones in the guidebooks. But also smaller, less photographed structures in Lyon, in Soissons, in Senlis. Different centuries, different architects, different patrons, different geographies. Same height, within 5 feet. The height is approximately 40 to 48 meters to the vault crown, depending on which measurements you use and where you measure from. But the clustering is statistically remarkable given the stated independence of each project. This fact is in the academic literature. It is noted, marveled at briefly, and then folded back into the narrative of Gothic ambition and the desire to build ever higher. The explanation given is competitive theology, each bishop wanting to outdo his neighbor, each cathedral reaching for heaven in a kind of sacred arms race. Which may be true, but it doesn't explain why they all stopped at the same height. Beauvais tried to go higher, and the choir vault collapsed in 1284. After that, no one tried to exceed the cluster. They converged on 40 to 48 meters and stayed there, as if that number meant something beyond ambition. I don't know what it means. I want to say that clearly. I have been looking at this for 3 years, pulling documents from the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and the FAPSP portal and the Bristol Record Office, and I don't have a tidy explanation. What I have is the shape of something I can't fully see. What I think, and I want to be careful about the word think because this is not a conclusion. It's an orientation. What I think is that the architectural history of the world before the industrial break contains evidence of a body of knowledge that was more unified, more deliberately transmitted, and more sophisticated than we currently credit. Not a secret, not a suppression, just a tradition that was so embedded in practice, so thoroughly located in the hands and eyes of craftsmen, that it left no formal record, and when the practice ended, the record ended with it. And what makes this more than an academic footnote, what makes it something I can't stop returning to, is that the tradition ended in a very specific window of time, not gradually, over centuries, in a handful of decades, between roughly 1850 and 1910, across cultures and continents that were industrializing at different speeds and for different reasons. The same cliff edge, appearing in surveys from countries that had no coordinated policy, no shared economy, no particular reason to make the same transition at the same historical moment. 3 nations, no shared communication, all watching the same category of knowledge disappear inside the same 60-year window. The evidence is still out there. The buildings are still standing. You can walk into the oldest stone structures in almost any major city in the world and look at the proportions of the doorframes with fresh eyes. You can pull the WPA architectural surveys from the Library of Congress. They're digitized, they're searchable, and run the numbers on the pre-industrial structures they documented before those structures were demolished in the urban renewal programs of the 1950s and 1960s. You can read Buckley's field notes at the British Library. You can access Ferraz's dataset at FAPSP. You can read Maunder's journal at the Bristol Record Office. The archive is real. The buildings are real. The ratios are real. What I'm less certain about, what keeps this inquiry open rather than closed, is what the evidence means. Whether the convergence was transmitted from a common source or arrived at independently through some deeper logic of human proportion and structural necessity, that we don't fully understand. Whether the knowledge that vanished in the industrial transition was practical craft wisdom or something more fundamental. Whether Thomas Maunder's last day at work was the end of a tradition that stretched back to the people who built the structures Buckley measured in Peshawar, who built the structures Faraz measured in the Andes, who built the tower at Great Zimbabwe that Whitmore found troubling. I don't know. That's the honest answer. I genuinely don't know. But the next time you walk through a door in a building that is more than 200 years old, look at the width of the frame, then look at the height. Write down the numbers. Divide one by the other. See what you get. And then think about the man who cut that stone, and what he carried in his hands, and where it came from, and where it went.